Welcome, everyone, back to the Art of Change, and we're in season 3 talking about compassion unleashed. And today I have with me again Julie Krause, and what we're going to be talking about is going into episode 3, which is building a culture of care. And so, how do we take empathy, build that foundation, put it into action with compassion, and then create that culture of care? And so, as we dive into this, just Julie, if you can go ahead real quick, what's your background again for the audience?
I know I've said it before, but real quick background, my master's degree is in clinical art therapy and counseling, but I've worked for the past decade in humanitarian aid, emergency response, and development all over the world.
Great. And for the audience, one of the things that I really want to capitalize today on this episode is talking about the fact of, Julie has a very unique experience, and she's got over 16 years out in the field doing this stuff, but she's actually been in crucial war zones, not in a military perspective, but in a therapeutic perspective. And she has some really interesting insights that we can really dive into on not just the empathy, but also obviously in the compassion and really applying this stuff. And so, what I want to do here as we go into it, right? I want to talk about first off, Julie, when you think of compassionate leadership, how would you say that fosters a culture of trust and loyalty to an organization?
Well, I think if you look at it, right, how we want to be treated, right? How we want to
Right.
be treated as workers is the same way that you want to treat others when you're a leader. It goes back to the really basic core thing that we all learn when we're little, no matter where you are in the world, is treat others how you want to be treated, right? So
Yeah.
how
Bringing it
how
back.
I'm leading others, right? How I'm explaining things, how I'm training things, how I'm listening. That's exactly how I would like to be treated myself.
Yeah, and I had a good conversation with a buddy of mine yesterday about this, and we were talking about how, we create an environment of trust, right? And we want our people that, are working for us to feel that trust. But that also goes to your leadership team. And
Right.
so I want them to trust me, but I want to trust them. And so it's a reciprocal feeling. And like you said, I think right back down to the core principle that we all can go right back to, grade school. Treat others how you want to be treated, right? And so I think that's a really important piece that you just hit on. So when we think about that, let's dive into that a little bit deeper. Why have we lost that? Why do you think as a culture we have gone away from some of that core fundamentals we were taught as kids?
I think a lot of it is insecurity, right? And that goes back to the trust component. And I know that's what we talked about in the previous episode is if you're secure as a leader and if you trust what you're doing internally, then you're going to allow freedom for your team to be able to do what they want to do, to be able to make those mistakes. Obviously, it's a little different in an emergency setting, in the military setting. You don't really want people to be making some of those mistakes, but at the same point, that's allowing that freedom allows for the trust as well.
Yeah, and I want to hit something that's a little off topic, but you talked about the mistakes, right? And I think as leaders, we sometimes get driven into us by excuse me, by our organizations. Frog in my throat. That we
It
can't make
happens.
mistakes and that we can't learn, right? We can't learn from these things and move forward. And so I think it's important for us as leaders to create that trusting environment where people can make mistakes, but you learn from those mistakes, right? And so I think I've a previous episode in Empathy in Action series, I talked about that with my other guest speakers, where we were talking about, Thomas Edison failed how many times, and I hate saying the word fail, but you know, um, didn't find the solution until the 10,000th time, right? And so at the end of the day, those are opportunities to learn and build and develop more. But if we don't
Right.
create that environment of trust to allow our people to make those mistakes so they can improve, what kind of culture and environment are you creating? And I would say that's a culture of no innovation, no creativity, just going with the motions to please the boss, just enough
Right.
so we don't get fired.
Right. Well, it goes even back to when you're interviewing people, right? This is a typical question that gets asked of people when they're getting hired, right? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Well, let's flip that word weakness. That shouldn't be used. Where are your gaps? Where do you need to grow,
Oh, I love it.
right? That's a
Yeah.
growth perspective. That's looking and seeing and recognizing that people do have the capacity, not saying like, oh, where where are your darkest demons? That's not what you're
Right.
asking for. You want to know how you can help strengthen the people that are coming on board with you.
Right. And then, it's a big one is, we're not going to be strong in every aspect of our job, our leadership, all those things. And we're not always the best, right? There's always I always remind myself, there's always somebody better than me, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, where I have my gap, like you talked about, what are my gaps? Can I strengthen them? And if I can't strengthen them, who can I use or bring on to fill that gap
Yes.
or help me develop my gap? Not because they're replaceable, but so I could be even a stronger of a leader or an employee at that, given position that I'm in. But
Yeah.
oftentimes people look at other people who have a strength in an area that I don't. People tend to look at it and go, okay, this is competition. And I want us to think about getting away from the idea of competition. We're all in the same boat of trying to improve our organization, improve the culture. And I think, one of the ones I love is there's a couple of organizations, Microsoft with Satya Nadella is a great example of one of, we don't see the other companies as competition. We see them as we're empowering each other to innovate. I think another good one is Elon Musk when he built Tesla and the EVs, electric vehicles. A lot of people said electric vehicles, it's been tried for years. Why? This is dumb, right? And rather than hold back on his patents and the ideas and the technology, he shared those. And that allowed for the electric vehicles to kind of, yes, there's competition, there's other companies making them, but at the end of the day, who is the lead on EVs? It's still Tesla and those
Yeah.
EV systems. And at the end of the day, if you fear competition, eventually your competition is going to catch up. But if you
Right.
empower it, you bring them on. Like one of the things I thought about with Elon is if he was smart about it, create those charging stations, but have them all use the Tesla type style, connectors. And then that way, every company don't have to make their own; they just use the same one. But then, if you're not a Tesla, you charge 1 cent more a kilowatt, or whatever it might be of whatever the charge stations is. But at the end of the day, what you're doing there is you're still offering because it promotes more people using it. It puts being invested into that community, and that's what companies like Microsoft have done and Google and all these. They don't look at it as we're not going to work in a vacuum. We see that there's going to be competition, but if we embrace that healthy competition and expand it, it will help our business improve as well. So,
Well,
from
and
your
it's the
perspective,
same thing. I was just going to say it's the same thing even with when it's not a tangible object, right?
right?
So I'm just thinking about recently when I was, when I was in Ukraine, working with Red Cross. So there's all of the different, country Red Crosses that are there. There's also ICRC, which is more of the emergency. They kind of function on their own, not necessarily as much partner with all of the other, like Ukrainian Red Cross. And they had finalized a guidance for something to do with mental health. It wasn't within my purview. Um, and a lot of times, what I've seen in the past is that, people want to like, oh, this is my manual, this is my guidance, whatever. And they're like, no, just share it. And that's a lot of what I've done too, is if I create anything, if I create a new approach to psychological first aid or anything, like that's getting shared. That's not something that I feel that I need to hold so close to myself that others can't use it.
Right. I mean, it's like we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but on top of that, if we're going
No.
to grow, if we're going to expand, even as a company, if I only zone in on the one thing I built, and I say nobody else can have that, and then I never create anything else, like Microsoft ran into that, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft for years, right? They're the lead. They have the highest operating systems. They have all these Office programs and things like that. But when you thought about Microsoft, and to this day, our viewers are probably doing the same thing that I did. What is Microsoft? Who are they now? Right? Cool, they're the lead of
Right.
that, but they're the thing of the past. What's the way forward? Well, reality is they're actually the way forward. They've innovated. They've created new ways of doing things. They've acquired companies that still operate, just like OpenAI. That's under Microsoft. Using Chat GPT. But they don't need to say it's Microsoft GPT, right? Like we don't care, right? It's at the end of the
Right.
day, we're all moving forward, but it falls under that Microsoft umbrella. And why that matters, just from a numbers perspective, because a lot of organizations care about data points.
Of course.
Microsoft in 2014 was a $300 billion company. And through the innovation, idea, and acquisition through Satya Nadella's leadership as a CEO, and he became CEO in 2014. Fast forward today, 10 years later, and went from a $300 billion company to a $3 trillion company. And the only things changed in there is how they acquired new technology, the leadership development of their people, and most importantly, right, was coming up with a strategic plan of how to innovate moving forward while embracing the idea of what others are doing as well, right? So great idea, concept, and most people would have been scared to do that. Took a gamble, and here he is, right? Pretty impressive. $300 billion company sounds pretty fantastic on its own, and then you hear $3 trillion, and I'm like, Microsoft could get the U.S. out of its debt, you know what I mean? Like, but
Seriously.
Yeah. So as we, when we look at that, what I want to talk about here is, a lot of times, organizations are going to ask, what am I going to see tomorrow by adding compassionate leadership, right? And the reality is the tangible item is not going to happen tomorrow. This is an investment to your long term of your organization, your people, and your culture. But
Yeah.
what would you say is the ripple effect from compassion? We drop that pebble in the water, creates these ripples, the butterfly effect, whatever you want to call it. What do you see that we get that? How does that strengthen the team dynamic and the culture?
Well, if you're trusting your team, if you're allowing that space, that freedom for people to do what they want to do, to grow, you're going to get people that are invested, that are driven to stay and continue growing. There's real buy-in there, right? There's not that, oh, I'm just going to a job. I'm going to like punch in, if that still even works. Like, I don't know, I haven't done a job like that in a while, right? But where you're going and punching your time clock
Yep.
and you go in, you basically take your brain out of your head and you're just like remotely doing whatever you need to do like a robot, and then you punch out, you put your brain back in, and you go on your day. That's not going to happen in that way, right? You're going to have people that are wanting to think creatively about what they're doing. They're going to be excited, and it's a longer term durability to whatever company it is that you have, whatever kind of the outputs and the outcomes and products that you're making, because people will feel like they're part of something. And people can't function in silos. Like we've talked about that. I don't know if we talked about it in the last episode, but I know you and I have talked about that personally. Is that you can exist on your own for a certain amount of time, but we're pack animals, and we need to
Right.
be together. And having people that feel that connection and that drive to be able to sustain change within your company, that's far better than continuing to rehire people just to get whatever job done.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, and so one of the things that I think about was in the military, I think I don't know if it translates civilian. We talk about first, second, third order effects, right? First order effects.
Hmm.
What's right in front of me? What is that going to change today that makes tomorrow better, right? But what we lose sight of, because it's harder to think about, is those second, third order effects, and that's what we're talking about here. By doing these techniques of being more empathetic, by adding compassion to our leadership tool belt, um, we're talking about long-term effects, and so you're not going to see those necessarily right away. But you're changing a culture, and I'll give you an example. In the military, I remember I started working in an organization where it was extremely toxic. We had bad leadership; they were making bad decisions. We had our commander was removed from command because of whatever they were doing. And I remember in that point when I was at that time, I was a lower ranked, and I remember thinking, well, one commander, one person isn't going to change the environment here, right? Like that's something we do at one level of middle management, which is usually true. However, having that CEO level, that commander who came in and really had that compassion. I mean, to this day, he's still one of my greatest mentors. Um, just shows it naturally, but create an environment, and by their leadership funneled down to that middle level management to allow them to create the environment that was a little more trusting and high in that high trust environment, and it paid dividends. I mean, we saw results
Right,
within 6 months, and we're talking about changing and reshaping an organization that had seen problems for years, and that
right.
all started with one person at the top having that compassion, creating the action, and pushing that down to its people. But then on top of that, empowering those people to make the changes needed to create a better environment. And so I
Yeah,
use that as an example because, oftentimes people are going to think, well, I'm just one leader. I can't really make that big a difference. And by yourself, that's correct, right? By ourselves, it's not always happening, but in a team effort,
no,
a team of
yeah.
leaders who all have the same vision, who have the same motivation to create that high trust culture, sometimes it only takes one at the top to filter that down. And then sometimes it takes that middle level to create the cloud, the environment that we all are driving to hopefully have every day when we go to work and be inspired and happy and motivated to be there, right?
Right, because often, it does take those leaders to do that, but often there's people that are down the line that want to change the systems, but because they're in a different role, they don't have the power, as it were, to make those system changes. So
Right.
that's one of the biggest things, right? Is that by being that leader and stepping into that, then you're also supporting others to be able to start to change the systems in whatever level that they're at. And it's wonderful.
Yeah. Now, so one of the last ones I want us to hit here is when we start talking about putting compassion to practice. What would be some of the things that you've seen or you would describe to be the ways to show compassion or to put compassion in motion? Because I think people often think they're being compassionate when they're really just being empathetic, which is great, but empathy is not action. Empathy is the start and the foundation of building those environments, but compassion is the action that we need to make sure that we not only create and empower that environment, but sustain that environment over the long haul. So, what are your thoughts
Right.
on that? How do we put that into practice?
Well, I think it's a daily practice for leaders, and especially people that are trying to change the way that they're functioning. If this is something that's a new concept or new topic to them, it's not going to be a like, oh, you listen to one of Tony's, podcasts, and then you're going to change everything, right? Like that's the
Right.
point where things you're excited, um, but it's going to take every day considering these things and reflection. And I know that's what we talked about previously. It takes all of those little pieces to be
Mm-hmm.
able to start to put things into place because just having the, oh, I would like to do this without having the drive behind it and
Right.
the security in knowing that what you're doing is the right thing,
Mm-hmm.
then it's really easy to allow that to drop. And then that's where things can become particularly challenging.
Yeah, let's get back to the one word I love that you said, reflective questions, right? Like that's so in my workshop, right? That's one of the key points I put in in the workshop is we have reflective questions for every technique and segment because that's how we go back every day, right? And one of the things I remember when I started going to therapy, my therapist, we would always go into, okay, let's talk about these let's go into reflection, right? And then what was one of the first assignments, and I know you'd probably done this a million times too, but one of the first assignments they
Yeah,
gave me was, let's do some of these questions at home, like look in the mirror and let's start answering these questions. And it seems silly at first, but how do
it
you
does.
reprogram and change and create a new way of doing things if you don't practice it daily?
Yeah, it's really rewiring because
Yeah.
if you're not used to pausing and saying, "Wait, why am I doing this? Why am I responding in this way?" Because it's something from within you, right? Rather than just immediately acting and just jumping on something, really just pausing, taking a moment and saying like, "Okay, well, what is that first?"
Right. Yeah. Now, lastly, I want to end this on for the certain, there's going to be the management level individuals that are listening to this and going, okay, compassion sounds great, but how do we manage the compassion with the objectives set by the business? So if an organization or company has certain objectives set out and we need to meet those objectives, how do we meet that with also applying compassion to our people? And one of the things I want to point out just as I'm thinking out loud here, being empathetic and compassionate doesn't always mean that there's a problem.
No.
It's just creating a positive or a more trusting environment as a whole. Yes, it's more important in the context when there's something negative happening. So, with that in mind, when we think of this is not meaning that compassion um, contradicts the business objectives. But at the end of the
Mm-mm.
day, like let's say we're talking about quotas, and our bosses come down with an objective of we've got to do our sales or this at for whatever. So how does balancing compassion with also hitting those business objectives, what does that look like to you?
Honestly, sometimes the compassion point in that is really reflecting, utilizing all of those data points that you've collected, over the past year for the production of whatever you're making, whatever you're doing, right? However many sales you're having, and are those targets realistic? And if they're
Right.
not, part of that compassion component as the leader comes into then standing up to whoever, the higher level management is and saying, look, this isn't realistic. Like my
Right.
team might not be able to do this. So like and being able to back that up with data that you have and saying, okay, well, here's my concern and really
Yeah.
clearly laying it out. And if they're not willing to listen, the reality and my honest concern would be that you're going to have a lot of people that are pushing forward. They're not feeling like they're safe to grow in whatever work that they're doing, and they're going to burn out. You're going to lose people. You're going to lose an
Yeah.
entire team.
Yeah, I said that was my last point, but I want us to end on a different point. You just talked about burnout, and I think that's a great piece that we need to make sure we hit here on this episode. When we talk about burnout, one of the things I see that companies often do, and if you're watching the video version of this podcast, everybody's gonna see my pen. And we have the x-axis, and that's your profit line, right? And you have, or excuse me, your timeline, and then you have your y-axis, that's your profit line, and somewhere above that median line is the what you minimal need for operational cost. Let's say it's whatever number you come up with. And oftentimes I think organizations, all they want to see is growth. They want to see numbers going up all the time. And that's not a bad thing, because we always want to improve, we want to make, more money, whatever
It's
it
not
might be.
necessarily realistic though.
It's not realistic. And what it
So
doesn't
to
do
say.
is, let's say today I say, Julie, you have to meet with 50 members, this next month. And you hit that number. Really, sustainability, I only need you to hit 30, but you hit 50, right? And then the next month you only hit 48. And I go, Julie, you dropped the ball on this. You only hit 48. You still well exceeded what we need you to do, which is 30. But now we've created an unrealistic expectation that creates burnout, because now we're setting the bar higher and higher and higher and every month. And so for the individuals finally hit this burnout every month because, okay, now I got to exceed this month. When the reality is we need to allow some cruising speed. We need to allow some gray area of like, okay, cool. This month was a slower month. You're still exceeding your quotas, whatever it might be. Next month, let's try and shoot a little higher again. Let's see what we can do on January or whatever it might be. And so let's talk about burnout. You've worked in certain areas where in organizations, I think, I've talked about this several times. Even you, who loves your job, 100%. I've never seen
Yeah.
anybody who is passionate about a job more than you do with what you do. And you've faced burnout. So what did that look like for you, and how did you overcome that?
I mean, it's hard. And actually, that's something that we talk about, when you're in grad school to become a therapist, you talk about that. So this is something that I well knew about. I was fully aware of it. I know where my boundaries are, but because it's not just a job for me, right? It's a career. And I'm so
Right.
driven to do something. Right, but I'll just give you an example. It's not the first. In my brain, and I don't know if this is, I don't have data to back this up, but for me, there's big B burnouts and little B burnouts, right? And so like I've had plenty of little B burnouts where it's like you just have to like pause, reset, take some time, like really, dig back into a lot of really good beneficial things for yourself. But um I was fully surprised by this one. Like last year when I was in Pakistan, it was for emergency response. It was the global, like through the government of the Netherlands and through the
Mhm.
global interagency mental health reference group. Like I was deployed to help start to build interagency coordination mechanisms for mental health in Pakistan. Right? That's a lot
Right.
of words, that's a lot of stuff. So, but and the people that I worked with, right? They're like, listen, this is really hard. Are you sure you want to do this? Before I even went, they're like, but honestly, out of everybody on the roster that we have, we know that the person that could be successful is you, right? So I already went into it having support, which was
And a
important.
lot of pressure, though.
Well, I give myself that pressure, right?
Yeah.
Like
But
I
that's okay. At
because
the
this is
end of
not
the day,
just a
we've
job.
had, right. You put pressure on yourself. The organization knew,
Yeah,
hey, this is going to be a tough job, and it's a lot of pressure on you, but we know you can handle it. But that's
yeah,
also, I bring that up because look at this. Even though that was pressure, which can lead to burnout, that was also trust. We trust
right.
that Julie is the person for the job to handle this and be able to push what we need done. And so
Yeah.
I think it's
They
important
knew,
to just highlight that, right? Because that's important, because
yeah.
sometimes we see that and go, oh my gosh, burnout right from day one. It was like, no, no, no. There's still going to be a
No.
lot of, you're going to get projects they're going to see overwhelming. And that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean it's going to burn you out, but at the end of the day, you need to be cognizant that it is going to be a challenge. And you have to
Yeah.
manage those challenges and all the other things that come with it through that, or you do face potential burnout. And then how do you alleviate that, right? Like there's different ways of, like, for example, you get a project, right? Your boss comes down with it and you got to get it done. You can't say no.
Right.
It's going to happen. But it's going to put a strain on your team. So how do we manage the burnout for our team? How do we avoid them getting the brunt of that burnout, right? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't think we're going to be able to answer that in this episode, but I want our viewers to think about that. Think about your organization and how can you apply compassion into it for things like burnout? Because the number one reason for members of an organization to leave is burnout, right? And so how do we do that? Things that are in our control versus things that are out of our control. And so
Right.
one of the things I want to talk about as we go into the next episode for next week is going to be, we're talking about sustaining compassionate leadership and doing the long game. And this applies directly. So it's a great segue for us to talk about how are we going to go into the next episode. So join Julie and I next week for episode 4, the final episode of our Compassion Unleashed series of The Art of Change. Once again, Julie, thank you again for being on with us this week. And viewers and everybody, subscribe to this video and to the podcast and be ready for next week's final culmination of Compassion Unleashed.
Thanks, everybody.